to initiate such a lecture series, which so many better-known institutions perhaps have failed to do. And the fact that I'm speaking on this topic here in America is perhaps all the more appropriate, since it is the land in which Tagore spent the most amount of time after India and Britain. He first visited this country in 1912, while accompanying his son Rabindranath, who was at the time pursuing his education in agricultural studies in Urbana. The following year, he won the Nobel Prize for Literature and became a much sought-after international literary celebrity. So much so that during his second visit in 1916, Tagore wrote to his close friend, the English painter William Rothenstein, complaining of his rising popularity in America and the effect it had on his own privacy. American people, he wrote, have an unhealthy appetite for sugar candy and for lectures on any subject and from anybody. Well, having said that, I hope Tagore was right about the American appetite for lectures, especially if I have to compensate for the absence of sugar candy in this room. Now, Rabindranath Tagore was physically a striking figure. He came across to many as an archetypal Indian mystic, an ascetic, dressed in white robes, with a flowing beard and an air of grave wisdom, the very image of a sage from the East, who confirmed, if you like, the cliché of India as a land of exotic mysticism and ancient spiritual wisdom. Or as the Guardian's Ian Jack put it, an embodiment of how the West wanted to see the East. Those who looked beyond his appearance and read his work knew there was far more to Tagore than met the eye. One of the things about Rabindranath Tagore that never fails to bewilder educated Indians is the extent to which his reputation has plummeted in the West, even as it has grown into immortality in India. When the Nobel Prize-winning polymath Amartya Sen published his brilliant book, The Argumentative Indian, few of any Western reviewers paid attention to his essay in it about Tagore. And yet, while the book was rightly lauded for Sen's superb marshalling of arguments for the existence of a liberal tradition in India, this masterly essay was a much-needed effort to reclaim Tagore's international reputation. The reason it was necessary is, of course, that whereas Tagore's greatness seems self-evident to most Indians and to all Bengalis, a 250 million strong group, Tagore is now unjustly misjudged in the West as a mediocre mystic poet, rather than as the remarkable rationalist and humanist genius that Sen convincingly depicts. The fact is, though, that it's genuinely difficult to explain to foreigners the scale of Rabindranath Tagore's accomplishments. Some have made glib comparisons to Shakespeare and Goethe, but neither man, despite his undoubted greatness, excelled in as many fields as the Gurudev, as Tagore, nor dominated his culture to the extent that Tagore did his. Think of it. He was not merely an extraordinary poet, the only Indian to win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1913 for his Gitanjali, profoundly moving verses written in Bengali in 1910, after he had lost his father, his wife, his second daughter, and his youngest son, all within a span of a few months. He was also a prose writer and essayist of the first rank, whose articles, books, and monographs commanded a wide readership around the world. As a philosopher, he was perhaps the first to develop a synthesis of Eastern and Western approaches, and he developed political ideas of great depth and humanity, of which more later. He was a great, if uneven, novelist and short story writer who produced several masterpieces that continue to be read a century and a half after his birth. His Kabuliwala is among the few short stories most Indians remember from their childhood. And he was also a playwright of rare distinction. His play The Post Office, for instance, was one of the most popular plays on both Broadway and the West End in London before the Second World War. But added to all that were his other remarkable talents. He was a painter of high quality and perceptiveness. an artist with a poet's eye. He was a composer of over 2,000 immortal songs, of which he authored both the lyrics and the tunes, and through which he essentially founded his own discipline of Indian music, known as Rabindra Sangeet. He's the only person, as you already heard from Professor Sengupta, to have created the national anthems of two different countries, India's Jana Gana Mana and Bangladesh's Amar Shonar Bangla, though both nations were born after his own death. And he inspired the composer of Sri Lanka's anthem as well, who translated Tagore's lyrics and set them to Tagore's music in a tribute to his mentor. As if this were not enough, you can see why Shakespeare pales in comparison. He was an educator of great vision and courage, founding Vishwabharati University at Shantiniketan, the abode of peace, to offer an authentically Indian experience of higher education, following systems and approaches of his own devising. It educated the likes of Satyajit Ray, the famous film director, and Indira Gandhi, a former prime minister, not to mention offering a cradle to Amartya Sen, whom I've already mentioned, whose first name, with its evocations of immortality, Amartya means that which shall not die, that first name was given to him by Tagore, possibly the only instance of one Nobel laureate baptizing another. If all this were not more than extraordinary, representing a level of achievement so towering that it's impossible to imagine an individual in any other culture who even comes close, there is also the remarkable fact of Tagore's huge worldwide impact in his own time, which even today's Indians may have difficulty imagining. Tagore was a global giant before the era of globalization. When he was to speak at New York's 4,000-seat Carnegie Hall in 1930, itself a rare enough honor, since the hall, as you know, is usually reserved for concerts, not orations. More than 20,000 people were turned away from the sold-out event, creating a massive humanity on the streets outside that blocked traffic for miles and occasioned an article on the front page of the New York Times. The traffic jam caused by people who couldn't get in to listen to Tagore. No living writer on the planet had ever had something comparable to that happen, and what's more, Tagore was handsomely paid for his speech. One American critic, not without a tinge of jealousy, wrote acerically that the Indian scolds Americans at $700 per scold. By today's standards, that would be more like $17,000 per scold in current dollars, and perhaps $70,000 in purchasing power terms. And there were quite a few scolds in every speech. Tagore himself was modestly dismissive of his fame and the attention it got him. The perfect whirlwind of public excitement the Nobel Prize has given rise to is frightful, he wrote to his friend Rothenstein in 1913. It's almost as bad as tying a tin can to a dog's tail, making it impossible for him to move without creating noise and collecting crowds all along. 8 years later, he confided to the historian Edward Thompson, what an immense amount of unreality there is in literary reputation. And I am longing, even while appreciating it like a buffalo the luxury of a mud bath, to come out of it as a sannyasi, a Hindu sage, naked and aloof. Now, as you've seen, I relish Tagore's prose, and like all fine writers, he had a rare gift of phrase. His description of the Taj Mahal as a teardrop on the cheek of time can scarcely be bettered. And which poet would not have wanted to have authored his line, "Who can strain the blue from the sky?" His descriptions of nature are startlingly original and thought-provoking in their imagery. The rose, he wrote, is a great deal more than a blushing apology for the thorn. Dawn is the departing night's kiss on the closed eyes of morning. Just imagine that for a minute. A picture is a memory of light treasured by the shadow. Sometimes the metaphor is explicitly metaphysical. In the mountain, stillness surges up to explore its own height. In the lake, movement stands still to contemplate its own death. Quote unquote. He lent to spirituality a literary succinctness few others could master. Life is given to us, we earn it by giving it. Or the poignant, and because I love this life, I know I shall love death as well. His stories and letters overflow with literary gems, each bearing an insight thoroughly steeped in Indian tradition. Quote, while God waits for his temple to be built of love, man brings stones. Or, he who does good comes to the temple gate, but only he who loves reaches the shrine. And, quote, darkness travels towards light, but blindness towards death, unquote. This is also true of his more social reflections. Nowadays, men have acquired what God did not choose to give them, he wrote in a short story. Or as he turned 50, elders have become cheap to modern children, too readily accessible, and so have all objects of desire. And throughout his awareness of the divinely created cosmos, the world is an ever-changing foam that floats on the surface of a sea of silence. Or, quote, man has in him the silence of the sea, the noise of the earth, and the music of the air. I quote all this to give you a sense of flavor of his way of using words, his imagery, his poetry. W.B. Yeats, in his famous introduction to Gitanjali, quoted an anonymous Bengali doctor as saying that, quote, we have other poets but none that are his equal, recall this the epoch of Rabindranath. No poet seems to be as famous in Europe as he is amongst us. He's as great in music as in poetry, and his songs are sung from the west of India into Burma, wherever Bengali is spoken. He was already famous at 19 when he wrote his first novel, and plays when he was but a little older are still played in Calcutta. I so much admire the completeness of his life. When he was very young, he wrote much of natural objects. He would sit all day in his garden. From his 25th year, or so, to his 35th perhaps, when he had a great sorrow, the tragedy I've told you about, he wrote the most beautiful love poetry in our language. After that, his art grew deeper. It became religious and philosophical. All the inspirations of mankind are in his hymns. He is the first among our saints who has not refused to live, but has spoken out of life itself. And that is why we give him our love, unquote. Tagore returned the compliment in elegant terms, writing of Yeats, quote, like a cut diamond that needs the light of the sky to show itself, the human soul on its own cannot express its essence and remains dark. Only when it reflects the light from something greater than itself does it come into its own. Yeats himself went on to observe, and I quote him again, these lyrics, which are in the original, my Indian friends tell me, full of subtlety of rhythm, of untranslatable delicacies of colour, of metrical invention, display in their thought a world I have dreamed of all my life long. The work of a supreme culture, they yet appear as much the growth of the common soil as the grass and the rushes. A tradition where poetry and religion are the same thing has passed through the centuries, gathering from learned and unlearned metaphor and emotion, and carried back again to the multitude the thought of the scholar and of the noble, unquote. For Yeats, their Indian spiritual content was their principal value. Quote, we fight and make money and fill our heads with politics, all dull things in the doing, while Mr. Tagore, like the Indian civilization itself, has been content to discover the soul and surrender himself to its spontaneity, unquote. Again, Tagore himself would have disavowed such grand claims as Yeats made. Quote, since it's impracticable to be uncivilized, I'd better try to be thoroughly civil, he wrote in 1892 to his niece in development. But admittedly, none of these distinctions, each rarer than the other, and I know I've spent too long on summarizing the extraordinary accomplishments of this man. But none of these necessarily offer an adequate explanation for the second part of the question that must naturally be on your minds: why should Tagore matter today? Yes, there was a time when Tagore was a global phenomenon whose aura and impact was felt in places around the world, like Iran, where he was warmly received and celebrated by the Shah; in South America, where he would go on to influence a young Pablo Neruda, the Argentine writer Victoria Ocampo, and the Brazilian poet Cecilia Meirelles. He was popular in China, Japan, Vietnam, Germany, Poland, all countries that, like the US, he went on big lecture tours of. At a point in history where networks between these countries were at a nascent stage and the idea of globalization had been buried in the fiery sarcophagus of the First World War. Yes, there was a time when Tagore's reputation and international image were so greatly recognized that you even had a rather bizarre situation where dictators like Mussolini and Stalin vied with each other to have him visit their countries in the hope of securing a symbolic endorsement from his presence of their egregious regimes. But that was all a considerable while ago, a moment in history that shouldn't necessarily hold itself to special relevance for us in the 21st century. And it's also true that Tagore was not always welcomed by Asian modernists in his own time. On a visit to Shanghai in 1924, his message that modern civilization built upon the cult of money and power was inherently destructive and needed to be tempered by the spiritual wisdom of the East, while Western ideas of modernity should be regarded with skepticism, led to him being heckled and booed by Chinese audiences. The communist poet Chu Chuibai wrote, "Thank you, Mr. Tagore, but we have already had too many Confuciuses and Menciuses here in China," unquote. And yet history has a way of repeating itself, and unless we learn from the past, the future remains unclear and challenging. As I've often said myself in another context, Professor Mayhem was telling you about my book, An Era of Darkness. I often say to young people talking about that book, if you don't know where you're coming from, how can you appreciate where you're going? So let's take a step back and look back at the world in which Tagore made such an impact in the 1920s and 30s. A period universally recognized being one of the darkest points in human history, which ultimately concluded in the monstrosities of the Second World War and the horrors of the Holocaust and Hiroshima. Across Europe, the far right and its populist promises to restore the historic glory and grandeur of their respective countries was finding unprecedented acceptance in society. Winston Churchill, for instance, now ironically hailed in the West as a standard bearer of democracy and freedom, was throughout the 1920s and early 1930s an open admirer of Mussolini, saying in the 1920s that the Italian fascist movement had rendered a service to the whole world. He made it clear, Churchill, that he had been prepared to do much the same in Britain as Mussolini had in Italy, had it been necessary. Churchill travelled to Rome in 1927 to express his admiration for Il Duce, 2 years after the murder of Matteotti, when the character of the fascist regime was well established. "I could not help being charmed," wrote Churchill, "like so many other people have been, by Signor Mussolini's gentle and simple bearing, and by his calm, detached poise in spite of so many burdens and dangers. Anyone could see that he thought of nothing but the lasting good, as he understands it, of the Italian people," quote unquote. Churchill declared in Rome, "If I had been an Italian, I'm sure that I should have been wholeheartedly with you from start to finish in your triumphant struggle," unquote. This is all in print and available. Suppressed subsequently was another story. The London Times, 21st January 1927, for those of you who have access. As for democracy, Churchill was a late convert to the cause. As late as 1931, he declared, in the famous speech in which he attacked Gandhi, "The Indian Congress and other elements of this agitation represent neither the numbers, the strength, nor the virtue of the Indian people. They merely represent those Indians who have acquired a veneer of Western civilization, and have read all those books about democracy, which Europe is now beginning increasingly to discard, quote unquote. Democracy was an idea that Europeans like Churchill were happy to discard in the heyday of fascism. When circumstances plunged him into becoming the standard bearer of democracy and freedom, he embraced the public relations opportunity. But remember that fascism had a much broader appeal in those days than is commonly realized. Protectionism was at an all-time high, with countries looking inwards as they moved to recover from the structural changes forced upon them by the First World War. Here in America, the Great Depression had set in, leaving 34 million Americans with no income of their own, and across the Western world, a nativist xenophobia had set in, based on intrinsic distrust and organized hatred of anyone who was deemed an outsider. Fast forward to 2018, and the parallels between the two periods are grim and offer a sobering reminder of the dangers of our times. Populist leaders or strongmen have resurfaced with aplomb in Russia, China, Turkey, the Philippines, across parts of Europe, and of course in India and here in America. The supranational institutions of global governance of the post-Bretton Woods era, the United Nations, the European Union, the IMF and others, are facing internal crises of their own, brought about by the continual reluctance to accommodate structural reforms within them to reflect a changing world that has moved a long way since the bipolar Cold War order. Xenophobia and anti-Semitism are back in parts of the world that one would have thought would never entertain such ideas again. Protectionism, at least partially, has made a re-entry into global politics. And worryingly, anyone who is an immigrant, a Muslim, or worse, a Muslim immigrant, is now looked at in parts of the world as a national security threat. As the British journalist Jonathan Freedland described the comparisons between the 1930s and the present, quote, for historians of the period, the 1930s are always worthy of study because the decade proves that systems, including democratic republics, which had seemed solid and robust, can collapse. That fate is possible even in advanced, sophisticated societies. The warning never gets old, unquote. Let us consider, for example, the widely discussed recent paper by the Harvard scholar Yasha Monk and his colleague Roberto Foer, who argue that the health of liberal democracies across the world is failing, and that former consolidated democracies around the globe confront imminent degeneration. Drawing on data from the World Value Surveys 1995 to 2015, they show there's been a considerable dilution of support for democracy and growing impatience with the democratic process, especially among the so-called millennial generations, those born after the 1980s, and that we can no longer assume that once a country upholds democratic institutions for a steady period of time, fosters strong civil society traditions, and attains a degree of wealth, that the future of democracy is secure in its hands. It is, they tell us, a fallacy, and we must always guard against complacency. Democracy, in other words, is being challenged even as we face a worldwide backlash against globalization and cosmopolitanism. An ugly byproduct of this is the rise of mandatory patriotism, and at its heart, conformity as the new badge of allegiance. The global rise of officially mandated nationalism is a surprising phenomenon of our times. The century began with globalization seeming unstoppable, national boundaries appearing ever more permeable, and states surrendering more and more of their sovereignty to organizations like the EU, the World Trade Organization, regional and global trade pacts, and to international legal institutions like the International Criminal Court. Few could have foreseen such an abrupt reversal of this trend midway through the second decade of the century. The global backlash against the forces that have defined the first decade and a half of the 21st century have taken on nativist hue everywhere. In Europe and America, this has involved racist hostility to immigrants and minorities, whether ethnically or religiously defined. Since such negative messaging requires a positive counterpart, nationalism has filled the breach, as a majoritarian narrative in each country has sought to subsume each country's diverse political tendencies into an artificial mandated unity masquerading as authentically rooted patriotism. We were discussing at dinner just before this event how the world was taken aback when America decided to elect Donald Trump to its highest office, seduced by the proposition that Trump would make America great again, which to many voters, of course, was also code for make America white again. In less than a year into his, just over a year into his first year in office, the president and his army of Trumpists have declared war on anybody who defiles the American flag, symbol of nationalism, with Trump himself suggesting extensive punitive damages for such an offense. And this is a country where the flag can form a garment to cover just about any part of your body. Similarly, the Take the Knee movement, started by the African-American football player Colin Kaepernick, kneeling during the national anthem right before a game in protest against what he felt was systematic and continued discrimination against the African-American community in the US, has been denounced as an insult to the nation. While several of his colleagues, including from other sports, were quick to show him solidarity and support, Kaepernick himself can no longer get a game to play his own sport. In India, we have leaders of the ruling party similarly denouncing those who refuse to declaim Bharat Mata Ki Jai, victory to the Mother Goddess India, as anti-national. Democracy matters much less, it seems, than such litmus tests of nationalism. Globalization had promised a world of dissolving differences and ever-expanding freedoms that would embrace and include everyone. Instead, today's reactive nationalism heightens differences, emphasizes singular virtues associated with a politically defined people, and seeks to instill loyalty and commitment to the state and its emblems. At the level of voluntarily flaunting the national flag, the national anthem, the lapel pin, and reverence for the military's sacrifices, I have no problem with this. But when these symbols are used to promote a sense of obligatory duty, rather than affection for the nation, for the idea of the nation, and compliance with a prevailing governmental narrative, rather than freedom for each citizen to interpret national loyalty in her own way, then I do have a problem. Respect for the anthem and the flag becomes a code for obedience to the state and the ruling party, and that's why, as I said, conformity has now become the new badge of allegiance. Now, why do I spend so much time on what's going on today in the world? Not just because these are troubling and potentially dangerous developments. The idea of the nation as an inclusive community of all citizens, one that allows each individual to shelter under the constitutional carapace, to pursue his or her own ideas of happiness, free from the stipulations of others, is being tossed aside in the name of a higher patriotic duty to an officially sanctioned version of nationalism. This is exactly what Tagore saw and described in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s. And it's reminiscent of the same slippery slope down which Italy and Germany slid into fascism and Nazism in the 1920s and 30s. Such fears may be exaggerated in today's democracies, which have modern means of communication, thriving free media, and social media. But can we honestly look at that period and say that complacency is still an option? Tagore foresaw and predicted the dangers of this narrow-minded nationalism, and was perhaps one of the greatest critics of a phenomenon that he described as, quote, a cruel epidemic of evil that is sweeping over the human world of the present age, eating into its moral vitality, unquote. It's safe to assume that Tagore's principled opposition to nationalism came from a perspective tempered by the experience of the First World War and the nationalist fervor that had gripped much of Europe and led to violence of a magnitude the world had never seen before. In a three-part essay that forms his magisterial work, Nationalism, Tagore, writing at a time when war was raging across Europe, was published in 1917, offered a prescient warning of the dangers of nationalism and the nation-state. Quote, when this organization of politics and commerce, whose other name is the nation, becomes all-powerful at the cost of the harmony of the higher social life, then it is an evil day for humanity. When a father becomes a gambler and his obligations to his family take the secondary place in his mind, then he is no longer a man, but an automaton led by the power of greed. Then he can do things which in his normal state of mind he would be ashamed to do. It is the same thing with society. When it allows itself to be turned into a perfect organization of power, then there are few crimes which it is unable to perpetrate, unquote. Ultimately, to Tagore, the moral imperative of humanity far outweighed the political and commercial impetus that came together to form the core of nationalism as he saw it. To him, nationalism was a distraction from the real problems of humanity, which he felt was social. To him, nationalistic fervor had come to a stage where the moral man, the complete man, is more and more giving way, almost without knowing it, to make room for the political and the commercial man, the man of the limited purpose. I'm quoting you. This, aided by the wonderful progress in science, is assuming gigantic proportion and power, causing the upset of man's moral balance, obscuring his human side under the shadow of soulless organization. Just think of what technology is in the process of doing to us today. And Tagore could have written the very same words in 2018. As was often the case with Tagore, he captures this morning best and most beautifully in his poetry. He has a poem called The Sunset of the Century, which he wrote on the last day of the 19th century, and I'll quote a bit of it to you. The last sun of the century sets amidst the blood-red clouds of the west and the whirlwind of hatred. This is 14 years before the First World War. The naked passion of self-love of nations, in its drunken delirium of greed, is dancing to the clash of steel and the howling verses of vengeance. The hungry self of the nation shall burst in a violence of fury from its own shameless feeding, for it has made the world its food. The crimson glow of light on the horizon is not the light of thy dawn of peace, my motherland. It is the glimmer of the funeral pyre, burning to ashes the vast flesh, the self-love of the nation, dead under its own excess. Thy morning waits behind the patient dark of the east, meek and silent. It was almost as if he was thinking of today's world when he wrote this poem, with this clarion call to beware the dangers of jingoism and chauvinism, cloaked under the garb of love of one's nation. But this is not to say Tagore wasn't a patriot. He would eventually return his knighthood to the British in protest of the massacre of peaceful Indian protesters at Jallianwala Bagh by General Dyer, an act that would lead Indians to regard Tagore as a great hero of the national struggle. Tagore wrote that he could not retain such an honor, a knighthood, in the incongruous context of national humiliation. At the same time, in a letter to the British C.F. Andrews in 1920, Tagore would admit, quote, "It is not that I do not feel anger in my heart for injustice and insult heaped upon my motherland, but this anger of mine should be turned into the fire of love for lighting the lamp of worship to be dedicated through my country to my God. It would be an insult to humanity if I use the sacred energy of my moral indignation for the purpose of spreading a blind passion all over my country." Unquote. So, a patriot, yes, and nationalist, no. Tagore did not really believe in nationalism, but in the values of the human spirit, transcending all national boundaries. My religion, he told Albert Einstein, is in the reconciliation of the super-personal man, the universal human spirit, in my own individual being. My religion is in the reconciliation of the super-personal man, the universal human spirit, in my own individual being. He had little patience with parochial forms of thinking. Our mind has faculties which are universal, he declared, but its habits are insular. In his book Nationalism, he expressed the view that there is only one history, the history of man. All national histories are merely chapters in the larger one. National pride does not feature in his thought, only the immutable goals of knowledge, learning, and the pursuit of truth. And this is where I will again quote the poem that President Grimsby already read out to you, but now you will hear it in the context of everything I've been saying for the last 45 minutes of what he believes in and how he wrote. Where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where words come out from the depth of truth, where tireless striving stretches its arms towards perfection, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habit, where the mind is led forward by thee into ever-widening thought and action, into that heaven of freedom, my Father, let my country awake. Typically, this is an inspirational poem that could serve as the anthem for any nation seeking freedom, while giving no indulgence whatsoever to Jingoism or chauvinism. For the chauvinistic glee with which I, as an Indian writer, am celebrating Rabindranath Tagore would not particularly appeal to him. He dreamt of freedom for India, but it was not merely freedom from foreign rule that he sought for his country. It was in a place where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, and where the mind is led forward into ever-widening thought and action, that Tagore hoped his India would awake to freedom. And his idea of freedom was indeed far more profoundly individual than national. Freedom of movement is not the only vital liberty, he said in 1916. Freedom of work is still more important. Nor is subjugation the greatest bondage. Narrowness of opportunity is the worst cage of all. One of his poems perfectly captures the paradox of the nature of personal freedom in an enslaved land. We were enslaved by the British. Quote, the tame bird was in a cage, the free bird was in the forest. They met when the time came, it was a decree of fate. The free bird cries, oh my love, let us fly to the woods. The caged bird whispers, come hither, let us both live in the cage. Says the free bird, among bars, where is the room to spread one's wings? Alas, cries the caged bird, I should not know where to sit, perched in the sky. Tagore's was a voice of freedom, but it was more important to him that every individual be free to pursue his destiny. Give me the strength never to bend my knees before insolent might, he prayed in Gitanjali. As a result, he was an iconoclast, dissenting not only from empire, but even from the political orthodoxies of his own country's struggle for independence. In this context, perhaps, his disagreements with Mahatma Gandhi are not so surprising. He objected to the Mahatma's non-cooperation movement on what one might term philosophical grounds. He considered it political asceticism, and asceticism was not something of which he approved. No, in its passive moral form is asceticism, and in its active moral form is violence, he argued, in a letter to the Mahatma's British associate C.F. Andrews. Nor did he have any patience for the Mahatma's method of fasting unto death. Fasting, which has no direct action upon the conduct of misdoers, he wrote to Gandhi in 1933, and which may abruptly terminate one's power further to serve those who need help, is all the more unacceptable for any individual who has the responsibility to represent humanity. Unquote. Gandhi was not convinced, but their exchanges are amongst the most stimulating intellectual pleasures of the freedom movement. At the same time, Tagore, though he was not a nationalist, was not exactly an internationalist in the classic sense beloved of UN aficionados like myself. He died before the United Nations was created, but he did not think too highly of its forerunner organization, the League of Nations. Tagore wrote of the League that it was well conceived in theory but not in practice, because it was an institution in which the world was represented by national governments and nationalist political leaders. It is, he wrote, like organizing a band of robbers into a police department. There is no reason to believe he would have felt any differently about today's UN, which is also an organization of states rather than peoples. When he won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1913, his acceptance speech, read out at the grand official banquet by the British Shashi in Norway, consisted of one sentence: "I beg to convey to the Swedish Academy my grateful appreciation of the breadth of understanding which has brought the distant near and has made a stranger a brother." Unquote. That's the entire acceptance speech. But Tagore did propagate something much more powerful than internationalism, as defined in the sense of global governance or even globalization, as is understood today. What Tagore promoted was a moral synthesis between the West and the East, at a time when it seemed as if the world was falling apart at its seams. This at a time when the West, with its imperial ambitions and colonial legacy, was looked at with much resentment of the East, and for Tagore to try and establish a moral commonality between the two was no simple task. But Tagore was quick to point out that even within the West, a distinction must be drawn between the spirit of the West and the nation of the West. To him, the spirit represented the moral convictions of Western society, what he categorized as its best contributions to humanity, from internationalism to the idea of rights-based democracy, to a focus on education and social development and so on. These were universal values that would go a long way to furthering the overall development of humanity. In stark contrast to this was what he called the nation of the West, a structure that was motivated by greed and self-interest, which used the tools of imperialism and colonialism to promote its malicious interests in heartless fashion and enslave others. Speaking on the Indian experience under the British, Tagore pointed out that this desire for a common bond of comradeship among the different races of India has been the work of the spirit of the West, not that of the nation of the West. Wherever in Asia the people have received the true lesson of the West, it is in spite of the Western nation. As I've already observed, with his long beard and flowing white robe, Rabindranath Tagore epitomized for many the archetype of the Indian sage, the precursor of so many godmen and gurus who followed his footsteps to the West. There is little doubt that his magisterial mind and his authoritative presence did a great deal to inspire admiration across the world and to spark a revival of interest in Hinduism and the teachings of Hindu spirituality. Tagore's Hinduism had little to do with the Hinduness sought to be promoted by today's Hindutva brigades in India. It was a faith free of the restrictive dogma of Holy Writ, untrammeled in its yearning for the divine, and universalist in its conviction and its appeal. This is what made his ideas so attractive to non-Indians. He had a great respect for Christianity, which he saw as emerging in many ways from Asia. "I think it has been the good fortune of the West," he wrote, to have the opportunity of absorbing the spirit of the East through the medium of the Bible. It's healthy to remind you folks once in a while that Jesus Christ was Asian. In his famous discovery of India, India's first Prime Minister, Pandit Nehru, fittingly acknowledged Tagore's contributions, noting that more than any other Indian, he has helped to bring into harmony the ideals of the East and the West and broaden the basis of Indian nationalism. He has been India's internationalist par excellence, believing in working for international cooperation, taking India's message to other countries and bringing their messages to his own people, unquote. As the historian Ramachandra Guha points out, when Nehru became Prime Minister in 1947, the influence of Tagore was quite strong in the direction Nehru chose to take his country towards. Tagore's ideas of a synthesis between tradition and modernity, between the West and India, was a guiding philosophy for Nehru as well, as evident in his efforts to keep India non-aligned during the Cold War era and to promote Pan-Asianism amongst India and its neighbors. Tagore was unusual in stretching his imagination to Africa, the title of one of his lesser-known poems, in which mystical imagery is married to a denunciation of colonialism. I'll quote a few lines from his Africa. "Alas, O veiled one, underneath the obscurity of your dark facade lay unknown your human identity, degraded by the collective gaze of derision. And then they arrived, manacles in hand, claws sharper by far than any on your wolves. They arrived, human rustlers and traffickers all, by vanity and arrogance blinded, sightless by far than your darkest, sunless forests. If Tagore, the man of sophisticated political, educational, and spiritual ideas, has dominated this lecture, it would be wrong before I finish to omit the other Tagore, the author of some of the finest love poems and songs ever written in Bengali. My personal favorite is one I read to my late wife upon our engagement, and I will embarrass myself by repeating it here, for it is too good to omit. I seem to have loved you in numberless forms, numberless times, in life after life, in age after age, forever. My spellbound heart has made and remade the necklace of songs that you take as a gift, wear round your neck in your many forms, in life after life, in age after age, forever. Whenever I hear old chronicles of love, its age-old pain, its ancient tale of being apart altogether, as I stare on and on into the past, in the end you emerge, clad in the light of a star, piercing the darkness of time. You become an image of what is remembered forever. You and I have floated here on the stream that brings from the fount to the heart of time, love of one for another. We have played alongside millions of lovers, shared in the same shy sweetness of meeting, the same distressful tears of farewell. Old love, but in shapes that renew and renew forever. Today, it is heaped at your feet. It has found its end in you. The love of all man's days, both past and forever. Universal joy, universal sorrow, universal life. The memories of all loves merging with this one love of ours, and the songs of every poet, past and forever. When the great British poet Wilfred Owen, author of what I consider the greatest anti-war poem in the English language, Dulce et Decorum Est, was to return to the front to give his life in the futile First World War, he recited Tagore's parting words to his mother as his last goodbye. When Owen was so tragically and pointlessly killed, his mother found Tagore's poem copied out in her son's hand in his diary. When I go from hence, let this be my parting word, that what I have seen is unsurpassable. I have tasted of the hidden honey of this lotus that expands on the ocean of light, and thus am I blessed. Let this be my parting word. In this playhouse of infinite forms, I've had my play, and here have I caught sight of him that is formless. My whole body and my limbs have thrilled with his touch, who is beyond touch. And if the end comes here, let it come. Let this be my parting word. And yet this magnificent wielder of words spoke modestly of the value of poetry. Words are barren, dismal, and uninspiring by themselves, he said in a 1922 lecture. But when they are bound together by some bond of rhythm, they attain their significance as a reality, which can be described as creative. The university of Tagore's thoughts and ideas seem to me beyond cavil, and his fears for the direction of the modern world as prescient then and as applicable today as when he first expressed them. With his typical generosity, Tagore said of the artist William Rothenstein, he had the vision to see truth and the heart to love it. The same was true of himself. Rabindranath Tagore would have won immortality in any of his chosen fields. Instead, he remains immortal in all of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tharoor. Thank you for bringing the distant near. And Dr. Tharoor has graciously allowed us some time to ask questions. Please wait for one of our students to come to you with these handheld mics so that we can be sure to get your question so that everyone can hear the response.
Will you play traffic cop and pick the questioners, Professor?
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor, for a wonderful lecture. I'm very interested in Mrs. Gandhi and her stay at...
Could you hold it up a little closer to you, slightly muffled? Yeah.
Can you comment on if she had, Mrs. Gandhi has written any in her paper...
Can I comment on?
Her stay at Vishwabharati and her
Indira Gandhi's stay.
effect of Rabindranath on her. It is very obvious in her personality, but I don't know if it's written or studied anywhere.
Yes, she has written about it in letters and interviews and memoirs. She's, I would argue that the biggest contribution of her Shantiniketan years was in the fine development of her aesthetic sense. She, I think, discovered Indian art, culture, fabrics, essentially through that process of being immersed. I mean, this is, as you know, in a very small town, essentially created by Tagore, Shantiniketan, which is in rural Bengal, it's not in the city. And essentially, the campus was it. That was all there was. And she, I think, was therefore pretty totally immersed in the ideas, music, art, painting. She didn't really have much talent, but she tried all of that. And came away, I think, with a very finely developed sense of aesthetic appreciation. And she could judge. I mean, I know it sounds banal to say this, but for example, her magnificent taste in saris was actually a reflection also of her respect for the traditions and craftsmanship that had gone into each sari, so that, you know, she knew, as it were, what the challenges were in producing the work of art that she was wearing, the sari, that sort of thing. So I would say that would be the principal contribution. It would be difficult to argue that she imbibed any of Tagore's political ideas. As you've heard me describe and summarize them, her view was very different. She was obviously much more staunchly nationalist. She was a bit of a big government kind of person. Tagore was much more committed to individual freedom and so on. So I would confine the impact essentially to the aesthetic and the cultural, not to the political.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Doctor, for your very engaging talk. Two questions. One is, Tagore is a great poet, but somehow his ideas seem kind of more impractical. Whether, you know, whatever you say is about nation states and about individual freedom, something more or less, I guess, similar to, in a way, to Gandhi's, his idea of personal freedom, Swaraj, which is self-rule, so which comes to more or less personal freedom. The second question I had for you is, could you talk about his relationship with Tolstoy? What impact it had on each person on the other?
On the first bit, I mean, I don't disagree with you that there's something impractical, particularly in a world of nation states, to imagine a world without national boundaries. And so you're right, I mean, to that degree, this isn't going to happen in any foreseeable future. Your country and my country, this country, are obviously extremely wedded to the sovereignty they've acquired, fought for and won, and they're not going to be able to compromise it to any notion of world government or anything like that. So I would say that that if you were to think of it as impractical, it's difficult to disagree, but then a lot of idealism is impractical. Where I would say that Tagore should be heeded to today is in his prescience about the dangers of nationalism running rampant. That when nationalism gets converted, as it was in the 10s, 20s, and 30s of the previous century, and as it seems dangerously to be beginning to be converted in the same decade, a century later, that is into this reassertion of national glory, strongmen leaders, mandatory devotion to nationality, national symbols, xenophobia, suspicion of foreigners, increasing economic protectionism. These are the very elements that Tagore decried at that time. And as I said, 15 years before the First World War, he wrote a poem about the world breaking down in war, and it happened. And after the First World War, he wrote again about the great dangers of what became essentially the excesses of nationalism in the shape of fascism, colonialism, imperialism that ended up in the Second World War. So, none of us wants to go through that again, I'm sure. And so paying heed to Tagore's warnings makes him sound a good deal less impractical. We can't abolish the states, but we can get them to behave better, perhaps, and strengthen those institutions that could help them to behave better. The problem is that, of course, we're not doing that. Those who are sitting on top of the heap in the institutions created in 1945 don't seem to have the vision and the breadth of humanity to make room for the newly rising powers, which would be the sensible way of accommodating them in a common shared global narrative. That means the very institutions that have kept the peace for 70 years after the Second World War are in danger of disintegration into irrelevance. A country like China is increasingly saying, if you won't give us a place at the high table, we'll go off and build our own high table. Belt and Road Initiative, New Development Bank, these are all the Chinese saying, we don't have space, at your table. And we all know, of course, you're either at the table or on the menu. And we don't want to be on your menu. So we're going to go. Now, this lack of imagination means that the institutions that have given us peace for 70 years are genuinely in danger. So I do worry, and I think Tagore's ideas and thoughts are remarkably relevant. About Tagore and Foster, I haven't paid too much attention to. There have been a couple of letters. I'm not sure the correspondence was particularly extensive. I am not a huge fan of Foster, I'd have to admit, and I'm sure there are others here who disagree violently with me. That message in Howard's End, only connect, would be the one thing that would have linked him to Tagore. Tagore was always wanting people to connect across boundaries, connect across states, make the stranger into a brother. But Foster was too much of a cynic for that. At the end of Passage to India, the Indian and the Englishman can never be friends. Even their horses rear apart. Not now, not here. Essentially, that vision of Foster's would not have been Tagore's vision. Tagore had excellent, close relationships across national boundaries and wanted the world to be that way. I'm sorry that's a superficial response, but I just haven't read more of exchanges between them to be able to say more than that.
What about Tolstoy?
Oh, you said Tolstoy. I heard Foster. I am so sorry. Tolstoy, of course. Tolstoy was a profound influence on both Tagore and Gandhi. Tolstoy had some very interesting spiritual ideas, and of course he was a bit of an iconoclast himself. And Gandhi discovered him while sitting in his ashram in South Africa and started corresponding. I mean, Gandhi had two famous sets of correspondences, and a slightly odd pair of people, you might think, Tolstoy and John Ruskin, the British poet, philosopher, thinker, and unto this last, and so on. Everyone's forgotten Ruskin now, but he was quite a giant figure in those days. Tagore, similarly, found Tolstoy absolutely fascinating. And the two kind of vaguely look like each other, big white beard, made of hair, and brilliant ideas. Of course, Tolstoy died when Tagore was a relatively young man, so their primes didn't coincide. So one can't suggest that they exchanged correspondence as equals. It was very much Tagore seeking to learn from the grand old man of Russian letters. But yeah, there was a lot of admiration there. Did Tolstoy have some impact on Tagore? Certainly. You don't see a lot of direct quotation or attribution, but certainly his ideas were profoundly influential to both Gandhi and Tagore, and I would say that many Indians in the first half of the 20th century took a lot of inspiration from Tolstoy's writings.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tharoor, for your lecture. As we all know that ideas don't drop from the sky, I would like to know the influences, the historical influences that that was on Tagore. He was born in the immediate post-War of Independence period, and then his period partly coincided with Karl Marx, and Tagore was an anti-imperialist. He was internationalist. So I would like to know if there was any influence of the Marxist movement on Tagore, and has he written anything, and if not, why not?
Well, because Marx didn't understand the slightest thing about India. And why would any self-respecting Indian take Marx seriously? Marx's writings in the 1850s for the New York Herald Tribune about India and about the Great Revolt are embarrassing. I mean, they really, this is a man who has such a superficial and bigoted knowledge of India, his fatuous ideas of Oriental despotism, his willingness to see British colonialism as some sort of liberating force, his complete inability to understand any of the social peculiarities of India, notions of class alone were all that he could use to explain every social phenomenon. So the answer is no. But of course, Tagore was born a few years after Marx wrote the few things he did write about India. And I don't know whether Tagore, as some of you may or may not know, actually dropped out of school. So it's not as if he was sitting around reading. And in any case, nobody in school or college in British India was reading Karl Marx in any case in those days. No, there's no way, I mean, I can't claim to have read every single word that Tagore ever wrote, but I've not come across any reference to Marx in Tagore's writings, and I certainly see no influence of Marx in Tagore's writings whatsoever. I just don't think Marx had a single relevant idea in the Indian context, and I'm not sure that Tagore would have needed to necessarily be affected by that. Tagore's anti-imperialism was all about freedom. It was all about respect for freedom. It was about, and yet, as you know, he nonetheless was profoundly questioning his fiction, for example. When he talks about, he has characters who are self-righteous nationalists, and at the same time, he undermines their self-righteousness through asking fairly serious questions about to what degree these characters are truly committed to freedom within their own social circle and their own lives. So no, I don't see the slightest shred of Marxist analysis in Tagore's writing, but I do see a strong commitment to individual freedom, a dislike of large, powerful state machineries, and that obviously includes empire as well.
Dr. Tharoor, would you have time for one?
Oh, we can take 3 or 4 more questions. I don't know when you're going to vacate the auditorium. But as long as people are interested, it's always good to engage with them.
We've got someone at the back.
Sure. And maybe we need to overcome your gender bias here, Professor Mam, and give some ladies a chance to.
They're raising their hands now.
Okay.
Dr. Tharoor, thanks.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. So you were referring about the situations back in the 1930s and what we are right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so here's the thing. At that time, back in time, maybe they were possibly not so much of a democratic concept as such speaking, but right now, whatever we are seeing the same situation, but it's all within electoral democracies. So my question is, like, while it is relevant to do the comparison, what do you think is the way forward? Like, what do you think should need to be changing from a fundamental level, and where should it be beginning from?
Well, actually, you're slightly wrong there, because Germany and Italy were electoral democracies. Hitler won a free election in 1933. He never got a majority, but he got enough seats to form the government. We invited to form the government, and from there, the rest is history. Electoral democracies can be subverted from within. There's absolutely no lack of historical precedent for that. And if a fascist can win a free election once, as the joke goes, it'll be one man, one vote, one time. And you won't get your chance again. So it can certainly can certainly happen. Of course, you're right that it's more difficult seemingly today when you've got free media, you've got social media, you've got all these voices. But who would have predicted some of the extraordinary things we've seen in the last few years? The rise of Erdogan in Turkey and the change in the Turkish constitution. The victory of Trump in America and many of the transformations that's bringing about. Trumpery, I guess, is what's going on here. The Brexit vote in Britain, which is shaking the European Union foundations. The recent vote in Italy. The 34% Marine Le Pen got in France. I mean, there's an awful lot of interesting trends. I mean, what happens if Macron is deemed to be a failure? Will the French voters have anyone else to turn to? They turned to Macron as a plausible alternative to the mainstream parties, but they wiped out the mainstream parties. If he fails too, then I think, Le Pen's message in the National Front may shock us all. So let's not be complacent. I'm not saying, there's a line, not mine, but a great line that says, history may not repeat itself, but it certainly does rhyme. And I think that you won't find exact parallels, but you will find enough that echoes what happened in the past, and that's why I say let's heed Tagore. Because unless we can start fighting back against rampant nationalism and the ever-present super-strong state, the danger of something like the 1930s, it won't look identical. It may not happen in exactly the same way, but similar sorts of things could happen. You could have, as I say, the rise of unpleasant governments through electoral means. You could have the collapse of the supranational institutions that they were part of. The European Union is looking shaky. The United Nations is looking hollow. There are real worries there. Not today, but 10 years from now, 15 years from now. And then you could find, indeed, with increasing protectionism, Mr. Trump has just announced some stunning tariffs. Others are announcing retaliatory tariffs. In response, you may again, this is exactly how the 1930s started, the Great Depression, followed because of countries, starting off with the US, putting up the tariff barriers that then led to major breakdown in global trade, and at the end of that, increasing hostilities as well. The whole Japanese project in the 1930s of the greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere was basically saying, well, if we can't trade with you because of all these barriers, we'll just conquer you and create the larger market we feel we need. Now, the Chinese may have already accomplished that without going to war to do it. There are some very interesting things happening, and I would say that we need to be alert. If it doesn't happen, great. If we can all go to our graves in the kind of relatively peaceful world we've seen for the last 70 years, wonderful. But I'm not betting on it.
Okay, so my voice does bring a change in the pitch in the room. My question is also of a personal nature. How has Tagore impacted you? Do you reach out to a book, an essay, or a poetry, or a Tagore or a Rabindranath Tagore during a crisis in your life, or at a time of joy or a time of sorrow? I'm interested in knowing that.
I admire him greatly, but I actually don't believe that imitation is the best form of flattery. So I've never tried to imitate him. His sensibility is very different from mine. And I've never considered myself a poet, so though I've written some poetry in some of my books, it's often, self-consciously mocking of my own pretensions as a poet. I've never tried to be a serious poet. Tagore was a very serious poet. I'm interested in spiritual ideas, but they don't infuse everything I think can write the way they infuse Tagore's. There's a real, when I'm choosing to write about religion or spirituality, I write about religion and spirituality. When I'm writing about politics or I'm writing about something else, one vocabulary doesn't seep into the next. So we're very different. I admire him hugely. I think he's just extraordinary for all the reasons I mentioned in the sort of first 25 minutes of my speech. There is nobody like him in any culture on the planet who has accomplishments as towering in as many different fields and that have made such a mark on the entire culture of multiple millions of people. He's just an extraordinary figure. And therefore, as one of the greatest human beings who ever lived in terms of ideas and accomplishments, I admire him greatly. But do I try and imitate him? No.
No, I don't mean imitate. Do you go and open a Tagore essay at a time of crisis?
Yeah. I read Tagore essays when I'm interested in the specific subject. So nationalism has been of great interest to me in recent years because of the rise of nationalism, not least in my own country. And therefore I've reread stuff that I read in my college days by Tagore. I have to confess I haven't read a lot of his plays for a long time. I remember reading The Post Office because it was such a big hit and so on. And, you know, I enjoyed it, but I was slightly underwhelmed. As I said in my comments, I thought his work as a novelist, short story writer and playwright was uneven. There was some great stuff, and there was some, but he was so prolific, it'll be a miracle that everything he wrote was equally good. I think that some of his poems are really unreadable today. Maybe because they weren't well enough translated, including by himself. You talk to Bengalis about Tagore's poetry, and there's a reverence that comes through because of what he did with the language, the sheer musicality of the language. And in many ways, the thing about good poetry is that it is at bottom untranslatable. That famous Italian phrase of the traduttore traditore, to translate is to betray. And that you cannot be fully true. So his greatness as a poet will probably always be understood best by Bengalis. And that's why Yeats, in writing that introduction to Gitanjali, kept quoting Bengali friends, you know, to explain how great Tagore was, because even he couldn't really pretend to know how great he was. But where the ones I read out to you are not only beautiful poems, but have all been very well translated, I thought, anyway. And so I shared them with you because they conveyed both the quality of his poetry as well as some of the stunning poetic quality of his writing. But that's about it. So yeah, I do turn to his poetry. At some point, in some maudlin moment, I think I wrote a little note to my family saying, you know, if you guys ever have a funeral service for me, I want these poems. And the one I read by Tagore, If I Go From Hence, should be one of them.
Maybe we have time for one more question at the back.
Thanks, Doctor, for the lecture. I learned a lot.
Thank you.
My question for you is, if you could pick one, who or what would be Tagore's biggest influence for his poetry?
Sorry, if I could pick one?
If you could pick one, who or what would be Tagore's biggest influence for his poetry?
Even an influence upon Tagore?
Yeah.
I honestly don't think there was any. He was a self-taught poet. I'm not even sure how much he had read of other poems. I mean, he must have read some. This is a man who essentially invented his discipline. So here's a guy who drops out of school, is sitting in his family is very well off, so that he doesn't have to worry about paying the rent. He's sitting in this mansion in the countryside, looking at nature and writing. And at the age of 19, he publishes his first novel, which is already considered a masterpiece. And from then onwards, he just keeps on going, you know, from strength to strength. Everything he writes is being read. People are lapping up his stuff. But I don't. But you know, maybe if there is somebody here who's read Tagore's diaries and can tell me that there was somebody he cited as an influence, I'm willing to be corrected. But from reading Tagore and from reading what I recall of his own writings, I don't recall him ever citing an influence. He did correspond and reach out to people like Tolstoy, but that was not about poetry. And he certainly doesn't betray in his writings any influence of other writers, poets, or anyone. I mean, you know, he made it all up. He created an entire world of Bengali poetry, just as he created an entire discipline of Bengali music songs, which hadn't existed before. Many of his ideas were ideas that no one had expressed before he chose to express them. He just was a remarkable person. So I'm sorry to say I can't give you a useful answer in terms of one particular influence. You will find in other contemporaries, I mean, there were people in the 19th century in Bengal, part of the so-called Bengal Renaissance, who were writing poetry and so on, including in English, and who were influenced by British poets. And so you find some pretty great Bengal. There was a poet about 2 decades or so before Tagore called Michael Madhusudan Dutt, who is very highly regarded even today. In Bengal, he talks about having read English poets of the late 18th, early 19th century and how they influenced him, and he tried to recapture some of their ideas and forms in Bengali verse and so on. You never find anything like that in Tagore. Tagore just wrote. And it's, I think there was something quite unprecedented in the kind of poetry he wrote. And that's one of the reasons he won the Nobel Prize, was that even though these other poets, and Michael Madhusudan Dutt is a very good example of that, were not unknown, had been translated into English, and were, others would have known about them, Tagore was considered to be in a league of his own. And just one slender volume of verse was enough to win him the Nobel Prize.
I can't think of a better way for us to begin our Rabindranath Tagore lecture series. Dr. Tharoor, thank you very much.